The Coos County Fair in Myrtle Point, Oregon, was the kind of event that locals looked forward to all year. A week of carnival rides, livestock shows, and community pride, where families and teenagers alike could escape the slow rhythm of small town life. The fairgrounds pulsed with energy rows of food stalls selling caramel apples and funnel cakes, the shrill laughter of children riding the spinning teacups, and the steady clatter of carnival games promising oversized stuffed animals to anyone lucky enough to beat the odds. For 14-year-old Jeremy Bright, the fair was supposed to be just another highlight of his summer trip. He had spent the last few weeks visiting his hometown, reconnecting with childhood friends, and enjoying the freedom of being away from home. The fair was where kids could roam without much supervision, meeting up with friends and slipping into the crowd unnoticed. But for Jeremy, the carefree excitement of that August afternoon would turn into something far more sinister. As the sun dipped behind the tree line and the fair's neon lights flickered on, Jeremy Bright walked into a sea of faces and disappeared. Jeremy wasn't the type of kid who would simply run away. He was responsible, well-liked, and deeply connected to his family. He stood out in a crowd already over 6 feet tall at just 14, with a lanky build and dark hair that fell over his forehead. Those who knew him described him as easygoing and fun, the kind of person who made friends easily. His biggest passion was basketball. He played for his high school team and had real talent on the court. His dream was to go far with the sport, maybe even play professionally someday. That summer, Jeremy and his 12-year-old sister Esty were visiting their stepfather in Myrtle Point while their mother Diane Bright stayed behind in Grants Pass. It was meant to be a break from the ordinary, a few weeks of summer fun before school started again. Jeremy spent much of his time hanging out with old friends, riding his dirt bike around town, and enjoying the fair. His visit was supposed to end soon. In fact, he had already called his mother a few days before, letting her know he'd be back home in time for an upcoming doctor's appointment. He had no reason to disappear. But on August 14th, something happened, something that took Jeremy Bright away from the people who loved him, leaving behind nothing but whispers and unanswered questions. August 14th, 1986 was an ordinary summer day until it wasn't. Jeremy Bright spent that Thursday at the Coos County Fair with his 12-year-old sister St. The sun was high, the air thick with the scent of popcorn and fried dough, and the fairgrounds were alive with movement. Jeremy and St. weaved through the crowds, hopping between rides and game booths, laughing as they tried their luck at winning cheap stuffed animals. At some point that afternoon, Jeremy and St. made a simple plan. They would split up for a bit and meet back near the Ferris wheel later. It wasn't unusual. Older kids often wanted a little independence, and Jeremy was comfortable navigating the fair on his own. As the crowds swelled with families and teenagers out for one last summer thrill, he vanished into the sea of faces. The plan seemed straightforward, but as the minutes ticked by, and then hours, St. stood near the Ferris wheel, scanning the shifting crowd for her brother's tall frame. Jeremy never showed. At first, St. wasn't alarmed. Maybe Jeremy had gotten caught up with friends, lost track of time. Maybe he was still wandering through the game stalls, laughing with someone he hadn't seen in a while. After all, it was a fair, the kind of place where time slipped away without notice. But as the evening stretched on, the carefree atmosphere started to shift. The sky darkened, the carnival lights burned brighter, and the crowd began to thin. St. waited and waited, but Jeremy was nowhere to be seen. When she finally made her way back to their stepfather's house, expecting to find Jeremy already there, he wasn't. The growing sense of unease settled into something heavier. As the hours passed and he still didn't return, worry turned to fear. By nightfall, their family knew something was wrong. Jeremy wasn't the type to just disappear without telling anyone. He had left his wallet and belongings at home. He had no money, no extra clothes. Nothing suggested he had planned to go anywhere. A quiet dread filled the house that night. Calls were made, friends were questioned, but no one had seen Jeremy since that afternoon at the fair. He had simply vanished. By the time morning arrived and Jeremy was still nowhere to be found, his family knew something was terribly wrong. His stepfather, along with friends and relatives, began making frantic calls. They reached out to people Jeremy might have been with that day, hoping someone had seen him after he left the fair. But every call led to the same unsettling answer: no one knew where he was. Jeremy's belongings remained untouched at his stepfather's house. His wallet, some clothes, and personal items sat exactly where he had left them. His mother, Diane Bright, was still in Grants Pass, unaware of the nightmare that was unfolding miles away. When she received the call that Jeremy was missing, panic set in. She knew her son. He wouldn't just leave without a word. Myrtle Point was a small town, not the kind of place where people simply disappeared. But as the hours stretched into an entire day, it became clear. Jeremy had stepped away from the fairgrounds and never returned. The Myrtle Point Police Department launched an investigation almost immediately. Officers spoke with fairgoers, checking for anyone who might have seen Jeremy after he parted ways with his sister. But the details they uncovered were frustratingly vague. Some witnesses claimed to have seen him leaving the fairgrounds in the company of older teenagers' kids who were known to hang around the area. Others swore they had seen him getting into a car, though the description of the vehicle varied depending on who was asked. Then, an even more chilling rumor surfaced, one that would haunt the investigation for years. Jeremy, some said, had been seen at a local swimming hole, a secluded spot outside of town where kids often gathered to drink and party. But the sighting wasn't ordinary. According to whispers around town, he had been dazed, confused, and possibly in trouble. Some versions of the story even claimed he was injured. But if that was true, then what had happened to him after? And why had no one come forward with real answers? The accounts were inconsistent, scattered like broken puzzle pieces that refused to fit together. But one thing was clear: someone had to know more than they were saying. And then came the rumor that sent a chill through the town, a story whispered in hushed voices, always just out of reach of confirmation. Jeremy Bright, some claimed, had been shot. According to this version of events, Jeremy had ended up at a house party the night he vanished. A group of older kids drinking, partying, maybe getting into trouble. Some said there had been a gun, that someone had been showing it off. Others suggested that an argument had broken out, that tempers had flared, and that a single fatal shot had been fired. The story changed depending on who told it. In some versions, it was an accident, a careless mistake that turned deadly. In others, it was something more sinister, an act of violence covered up in a panic. But there was no body, no blood, no crime scene, just a dark story that refused to go away. Local law enforcement had heard it all before: rumors, speculation, second-hand accounts. But the problem was, no one could or would name names. If someone in Myrtle Point knew the truth, they weren't talking. And with no evidence to prove what really happened that night, Jeremy's case remained an agonizing mystery. But here's what made the case even stranger. Jeremy had no reason to disappear. Just days before he went missing, he had called his mother, Diane Bright. It was a casual, ordinary conversation until, in hindsight, it wasn't. He had told her he'd be home soon, that his summer visit was coming to an end. He even mentioned a doctor's appointment in Grants Pass that he planned to make. There was no hesitation, no sign that he was in trouble or thinking about running away. His mother would later say that nothing about that call seemed out of the ordinary. If anything, it reassured her that Jeremy was safe and enjoying his time with family. But now, looking back, it felt different. Had something already been wrong? Had Jeremy been worried about something but kept it to himself? Or was the phone call just a tragic coincidence, the last time Diane Bright would ever hear her son's voice? If Jeremy had planned to come home, then what had stopped him? What happened in the hours between his last phone call and the moment he vanished? And why, after all these years, was no one willing to come forward with the truth? But there was another theory, one that carried a different kind of darkness, the possibility of an overdose. Jeremy had been hanging out with older teenagers in the days leading up to his disappearance, kids who were rumored to dabble in drugs. Some believed he may have experimented that night, maybe for the first time, maybe just to fit in. But something went wrong. Maybe he took too much. Maybe it wasn't what he thought it was. Maybe, in a moment of terror, those around him realized he wasn't waking up. The idea was chilling. A group of scared teenagers panicking over the body of a friend. They could have called for help. They could have gone to the police, to an adult, to anyone. But what if they didn't? What if, in their fear, they made a terrible decision to hide what had happened instead? This theory explained why no one had come forward, why Jeremy's body had never been found. It wasn't about a murder. It was about a secret too heavy for a small town to carry, a secret that could have been buried literally somewhere in the remote woods of Coos County. If that's what happened, then someone out there knows the truth, and they've been living with it for nearly 4 decades. Despite multiple searches, not a single trace of Jeremy Bright was ever found. No clothes, no body, no personal items, no physical evidence to prove what happened that night. Law enforcement combed through the nearby forests, checking trails, back roads, and abandoned logging sites where a body could have been hidden. Divers searched rivers and lakes, their movements slow and methodical, hoping for any sign that Jeremy had ended up in the water, but nothing surfaced. Over the years, tips would trickle in anonymous calls, cryptic letters, second-hand confessions whispered through the town. But every lead led to the same dead end. Myrtle Point, a place where everyone knew everyone, had gone silent. Either no one truly knew what had happened, or the ones who did were too afraid to speak. And that silence has lasted for nearly 40 years. As the days turned into weeks, the search for Jeremy Bright stretched into something more unsettling, an absence that refused to fade. The Coos County Fair came to an end, its flashing lights dimming, its carnival rides dismantled, and its crowds dispersing. What had once been a place of joy and celebration was now just an empty field, carrying the weight of an unresolved tragedy. But while the fair moved on, the Bright family was stuck in an unrelenting cycle of uncertainty. Flyers with Jeremy's picture were plastered across town. Missing posters curled at the edges as the summer heat gave way to fall. Rumors continued to swirl, but none of them led anywhere solid. Police questioned witnesses, but no one had an answer. No arrests were made. No new evidence surfaced. For Myrtle Point, life continued. For Jeremy's family, it had stopped. And as the weeks stretched into months, one horrifying question loomed larger. Was Jeremy even alive anymore? Years passed, and so did new leads. Some were promising. Most led nowhere. Then, in 2011, investigators received a tip, a chilling one. Someone claimed that Jeremy's body had been buried in an abandoned well just outside of town. It wasn't the first time police had been led down a path like this, but they had to follow it. What if this was the break they had been waiting for? Authorities searched the site, digging through years of overgrown brush and debris. But when they reached the bottom of the well, there was nothing. No bones, no clothing, no sign that Jeremy had ever been there. Another dead end. Another blow to a case already full of them. This was the pattern. Every few years, another whisper, another tip, another desperate attempt to uncover the truth. And every time, the same crushing disappointment. Myrtle Point had kept its secrets well, maybe too well. Then, years later, Another strange lead emerged, this time from inside a prison cell. An inmate whose name was never publicly released claimed to know exactly what had happened to Jeremy Bright. According to him, Jeremy had been murdered, his body hidden deep in the rugged wilderness of Coos County, a place so remote that no one would ever think to search there. For a moment, it seemed like this could be the breakthrough everyone had been waiting for. The police followed up, pressing the inmate for details. Where exactly was the body? Who was responsible? How did he know? But the answers were vague, frustratingly incomplete. Investigators searched locations that matched his description, hoping for even the smallest clue. But just like every other lead before it, this one unraveled. No body, no evidence, nothing to prove that Jeremy had ever been buried at all. So was the inmate lying? Was he playing a game, hoping for attention or a reduced sentence? Or had he once heard the real story, one that had been passed around in whispers among those who knew too much? If there was any truth to what he said, it meant that somewhere out in the vast, untamed stretches of Coos County, Jeremy Bright's remains could still be waiting to be found. As the years went on, another disturbing possibility took hold, one that felt even more personal. What if Jeremy had been taken by someone he knew? Myrtle Point wasn't the kind of place where strangers lurked in the shadows, waiting to snatch kids off the streets. It was a small, tight-knit town. People knew each other. They watched out for each other. If Jeremy had been abducted by a random predator, wouldn't someone have seen something, heard something? Wouldn't there have been a struggle, a cry for help? But what if it wasn't a stranger? Some believed that Jeremy had left the fairgrounds willingly, possibly with someone he trusted. Maybe an older friend, an acquaintance, or even an authority figure. Someone who convinced him that there was no danger until it was too late. If that were the case, then whoever was responsible had spent nearly 4 decades walking free, blending in, keeping their secret. And that secret may never have come to light because Myrtle Point had never truly turned on one of its own. One detail has always haunted this case, something small, almost insignificant on its own, but deeply unsettling in the larger picture. Jeremy had a watch. Not just any watch, but one he cherished, something he wore all the time. It wasn't expensive, but to him it mattered. And after he disappeared, that watch should have vanished with him. But years later, his mother, Diane Bright, heard something that sent a shiver down her spine. A friend of Jeremy's had seen it, his watch, on the wrist of someone else. The implications were chilling. If Jeremy had truly vanished without a trace, then how had his watch ended up in someone else's possession? Had he given it away willingly? Unlikely. Had it been taken from him? And if so, under what circumstances? Most disturbingly, if this was true, did that person know more than they were letting on? Police tried to track down leads about the watch, but like everything else in this case, it led nowhere. By the time anyone thought to investigate it, too much time had passed. The person rumored to have been wearing it denied any involvement, and the watch itself was never recovered. But for Jeremy's family, that detail lingered like a splinter, an object that should have offered answers, but instead only raised more questions. There were too many loose ends. The fair, the party, the rumors of a shooting, the whispers of an overdose, the inmate's cryptic confession, the resurfaced watch. Every theory had merit, but none led to concrete answers. It was as if Jeremy's case had been buried beneath layers of fear, guilt, and silence, pieces of a puzzle that refused to fit together. And as time passed, so did the people who might have known the truth. Some moved away, some grew older and chose to forget. Some took their secrets to the grave. What really happened that night in August 1986? Had Jeremy been the victim of an accident covered up in panic, a senseless act of violence, Or had something even more sinister unfolded, something Myrtle Point had spent decades keeping quiet? The answers were out there, but after all these years, would anyone be brave enough to tell them? For the Bright family, the pain never faded. Time didn't soften the edges of their grief, it only deepened the void. Every birthday, every holiday, every passing year was another reminder that Jeremy wasn't coming home. But his mother, Diane Bright, refused to let his name become just another statistic, another cold case collecting dust in police archives. She fought tirelessly for answers, chasing every lead, no matter how small or how unlikely. She spoke to anyone who might have known something, former classmates, neighbors, even strangers who claimed to have insight into that night. She kept the case alive when others were ready to forget. She would later say that the hardest part wasn't just the loss, it was the silence, the not knowing, the way Myrtle Point had moved on, how the fair returned year after year as if nothing had happened, as if a 14-year-old boy hadn't vanished into its crowds. Jeremy wasn't just a name on a missing poster to her. He was her son, and she would never stop looking for him. If Jeremy Bright were alive today, he would be in his 50s. He would have lived more years missing than he had present in this world. But Myrtle Point hasn't forgotten him, not entirely. His case still lingers in the town's collective memory, an unsolved mystery that refuses to be erased. The fair still returns each summer, bringing with it the same bright lights, the same laughter, the same festive spirit that once surrounded Jeremy in his final moments. But for those who remember, it's also a reminder of what was lost. His mother has spent decades searching, hoping for closure. The investigators who once worked his case have either retired or moved on, leaving behind an unsolved file that has long since grown cold. But cold cases have a way of resurfacing. All it takes is one person, one truth finally spoken after all these years, because somewhere out there, buried beneath the decades of silence, the answer to Jeremy Bright's disappearance still exists. And the real question is, will it ever be found? What really happened to Jeremy Bright? Theories swirl like the summer dust that once kicked up from the fairgrounds, each one carrying its own weight, its own disturbing possibilities. Did Jeremy meet with foul play at the hands of someone he trusted? Someone who lured him away from the lights and music of the fair, knowing he wouldn't suspect a thing? If that's true, then this wasn't a random tragedy, it was a betrayal. A crime committed by someone close enough to earn his trust, close enough to make him drop his guard. Or was it an accident that spiraled into something far worse? A night of reckless teenage choices, an overdose, a shooting, an event that could have been survivable if only someone had called for help. Instead, fear took over, panic, and the people involved made a choice that haunted them forever. And then there's the question that lingers in the darkest corners of this case. Was it something even worse? Something the town of Myrtle Point has never been willing to face? The kind of truth that people keep buried not just out of fear, but out of self-preservation. If Jeremy's disappearance was the result of a crime, then someone, maybe multiple people, has carried the weight of that secret for decades. And still, no one has spoken. Perhaps the most haunting question of all is this: if Jeremy is out there, buried in some forgotten place, does someone still hold the key to unlocking his fate? Does someone in Myrtle Point, even today, wake up in the middle of the night thinking about that evening in August 1986? Do they carry the weight of a secret too dark to reveal? Or has the truth been buried so deep that even those responsible have convinced themselves it never happened? It only takes one person, one confession, one sliver of information that could finally answer the questions that have tormented Jeremy's family for nearly 40 years. But the silence has lasted this long. And if someone does know what happened to Jeremy Bright, will they ever speak?